The stones of the market square were cold and unforgiving, a hard truth that seeped through the thin fabric of her worn chemise. Lady Serafina of the House of Valerus did not feel the chill in her bones, for the ice that encased her heart was far more profound. She stood upon a wooden block, a pedestal of shame, her belly swollen with the life that had sealed her damnation. The murmur of the crowd was a tide of judgment, each whisper a sharp pebble thrown against her pride. They saw not the girl who had once read poetry in sun-drenched gardens, but a vessel of sin, a tarnished jewel cast out for the world to scorn. Her father, Duke Valerus, stood on the balcony of the Guildhall, his face a mask of iron righteousness. He had orchestrated this theatre of humiliation with the same chilling precision he used to command his armies. This was not about justice, it was about branding, about cauterizing the stain of her unsanctioned love from the immaculate tapestry of their lineage. He raised a hand, and a hush fell over the square, a silence more terrifying than the noise. His voice, a resonant blade, cut through the air. Behold the fruit of disobedience. A daughter who forgot her station, who chose passion over purity. Her name is erased. Her legacy is ash. Let her be a lesson. Whatever scraps she might fetch will go to the city coffers, a pittance to cleanse the filth she has brought upon my house. He did not look at her. He spoke of her as one would speak of spoiled grain or a lame horse. Serafina kept her gaze fixed on a loose cobblestone at her feet, a universe of grey imperfection. To look up would be to meet their eyes, the curious, the scornful, the pitying. Pity was the cruelest of them all. Her love, a knight of little name but immense honor, was long dead, silenced by her father's assassins for the crime of loving her. Now, she and their unborn child were being disposed of with far more public spectacle. The auctioneer, a man whose hands were stained with the grime of 1,000 sordid transactions, began his spiel. He did not speak of her education, her grace, or her knowledge of ledgers and letters. He spoke of a strong back for scrubbing floors, of hands that could still mend, of a body that, once unburdened, could serve a new master. She was livestock. The bidding began, a pathetic farce of coppers and insults. A baker offered a sack of stale bread. A tanner offered a bundle of scarred hides. Each bid was a hammer blow against the woman she once was, shattering the stained glass memories of her past. She felt the life inside her give a faint, fluttering kick, a secret pulse of rebellion in the face of utter degradation. It was for this child she held herself erect, for this tiny, innocent soul that she refused to weep. From the edge of the crowd, a man listened, his world a symphony of sounds and smells. Callan, the blacksmith, could not see the spectacle, but he could hear it all, the brittle arrogance in the Duke's voice, the greasy opportunism of the auctioneer, the collective, shallow breathing of the crowd. He had lost his sight years ago in the same fire that had claimed his wife, a blaze that had seared the world into a permanent darkness but had sharpened every other sense to a razor's edge. He smelled the city's sour breath, the damp wool of the onlookers, and beneath it all, a faint, clean scent of lavender and despair emanating from the block. He was a man carved from loss, his heart a quiet, hollowed-out chamber where memories of his laughing Elara echoed. He had 2 children of his own, 8-year-old Lyra, whose chatter was a balm to his soul, and 6-year-old Finn, who had not spoken a word since the day he'd watched the flames consume their mother and his father's sight. Callan had no need for a servant. His hands, though calloused and strong, were gentle with his children, and his home was orderly in its own way. But he heard something in the utter silence of the woman on the block. It was a silence that screamed. It was the same silence that lived in his son. "I will take her," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of the forge, a low rumble of iron uncertainty that cut through the sneering bids. A ripple of disbelief passed through the crowd. The blind blacksmith? What use had he for a disgraced noblewoman? The auctioneer squinted. And what does the smith offer for this fine piece? The sarcasm was thick. Callan reached into the large sack at his feet. The sounds that followed were a language the merchants understood. The solid clink of forged steel hinges, the heavy thud of a dozen custom-made axe heads, the metallic whisper of finely wrought chains. It was a fortune in craftsmanship, a month's worth of his finest work, the fulfillment of a lucrative contract for the Duke's own barracks. "My current contract," Callan stated simply. The value is 10 times what has been offered. The auctioneer's jaw went slack. Duke Valeroux, on his balcony, gave a barely perceptible nod. To him, the transaction was perfect. His daughter, sold for the very materials of war and industry that fueled his power. It was a fittingly cold and practical end. The bargain was struck. The crowd parted as Kalen was led toward the block, his hand resting on his daughter Lyra's shoulder to guide him. He stopped before Serafina, the scent of coal smoke and honest sweat a stark contrast to the cloying perfumes of the court she had known. He did not touch her. He simply said, "My home is this way, my lady." The title, spoken without a trace of irony, was the first crack in the ice around her heart. The journey from the market square to the blacksmith's cottage was a descent into another world. The grand, sterile avenues of the noble quarter gave way to narrow, winding lanes paved with mud and life. The air, which had once smelled of manicured roses and beeswax, now tasted of wood smoke, baking bread, and the sharp tang of hot metal. Kalen's home was attached to his forge, a solid structure of timber and stone that seemed to have grown from the earth itself. Inside, the main room was dominated by a stone hearth, its embers glowing with a welcoming heat that felt alien to Serafina's chilled soul. The furniture was sparse and handmade, a sturdy table, a few chairs, shelves filled not with gilded books but with earthenware pottery and bundled herbs. It was humble, yet it possessed a warmth and integrity her father's castle had always lacked. Kalen's children stood by the fire, watching her with wide, solemn eyes. Lyra, the girl, had her father's dark hair but her mother's bright, inquisitive gaze. Finn, the boy, hid partially behind his sister, his expression a locked door of silent observation. He was beautiful and broken, and Serafina felt a pang of recognition. Serafina braced herself for orders, for the litany of chores that would define her new existence. She expected to be pointed toward a pile of laundry or a cold corner of the floor where she would sleep. Instead, Kalen spoke to his daughter. "Lyra, please show Lady Serafina to my room. She and the child will need the rest." "We will take the loft." Lyra nodded and led Serafina toward a small, private chamber. It contained a simple rope bed with a thick wool mattress and a clean, patched quilt. A small window looked out onto a patch of winter-bare garden. There was a pitcher of water and a basin on a small stand. It was more consideration than she had been shown in months. Later, seated at the table, a bowl of hot stew was placed before her. It was simple fare, root vegetables, barley, a few pieces of tough meat, but it was hot and nourishing. She ate mechanically at first, then with a hunger that surprised her. All the while, Kalen and his children were quiet, a small family unit moving with a practiced, gentle rhythm in the firelight. No one gawked at her belly. No one whispered about her shame. In the oppressive silence of her disgrace, this simple, unadorned respect was a lifeline. For 3 days, a strange and fragile peace settled in the cottage. Serafina rested, her body and spirit slowly beginning to thaw. She watched Kalen work. Though blind, he moved through his forge with an almost supernatural grace. He knew every tool by its weight and balance, every inch of his anvil by the echo of his hammer. He discerned the temperature of the steel by its smell and the song it sang as he worked it. He was an artist, his blindness not a weakness but a different way of seeing the world, a perception that relied on truth and touch, not on surface appearances. On the 4th evening, as Lyra struggled to decipher a page from a worn primer, Kalen finally revealed his motive. "My wife," he began, his voice soft as he stoked the fire, "she was the light of this house in more ways than one. She read to us every night. Stories of ancient kings, poems about the sea. She was teaching the children their letters." He paused, turning his sightless eyes toward Serafina. "The merchants in the square saw a fallen noble. I heard a woman who was educated. My children have had no one to teach them since the fire. Lyra tries, but she is only a child herself. I did not buy a servant, Lady Serafina. I hope to welcome a teacher." The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. A teacher. Not a scullery maid, not a pariah, but a teacher. He saw not her shame, but her mind. He saw a skill, a value that her own father had deemed worthless. For the first time in nearly a year, a sense of purpose, fragile as a butterfly's wing, fluttered within her. The next evening, she took the primer from Lyra's hands. Her voice, at first, was a reedy whisper, stiff with disuse. But as she read the simple words, it regained its timbre, its cadence. She looked up and saw Lyra hanging on every syllable, her face alight with understanding. And Finn, silent Finn, had crept closer, his gaze fixed on her face, his small hand still. A task. A reason. It was a foundation, no matter how small, upon which she could begin to rebuild a life. The days found a new rhythm. Mornings were for lessons. Seraphina taught Lyra her letters and numbers, using charcoal on a slate Kaelin had smoothed for them. In the afternoons, she would sit by the forge, reading aloud from the one precious book Kaelin owned, a collection of epic poems his wife had treasured. She read of heroes and monsters, of loyalty and betrayal, and as she did, she found her own story woven into the ancient verses. Kaelin would listen as he worked, the rhythmic clang of his hammer providing a percussive beat to her narration. He learned her voice, its rises and falls, its moments of quiet sorrow and flashes of defiant strength. One evening, a raw wind howled outside, rattling the shutters and driving sleet against the window panes. A profound melancholy had settled over the cottage, a gloom that matched the weather. Kaelin had been quiet all day, his movements heavier, the memory of his wife a palpable presence in the room. Sensing his grief, Seraphina began to speak, not from the book, but from her own heart. She told him of her love for the knight, of their secret meetings in the castle library, of his gentle strength and the way he had seen her not as a duke's daughter, but as a woman. She spoke of the hope they had shared for the child she now carried, a hope that had been brutally extinguished. As she spoke, the tears she had held back for so long finally fell, silent drops that traced paths of salt on her cheeks. Kaelin stopped his work, listening in the darkness. When she finished, her voice choked with sorrow, he came and sat at the table opposite her. He spoke of the fire, of the terror and the heat, of pushing his children to safety but being unable to reach his Ilara in time. He described the pain, and then the final, terrifying silence as the world went dark forever. He had never spoken of it so plainly to anyone. In the shared space of their grief, a new and profound connection was forged. They were two survivors, two souls marked by loss, finding solace not in forgetting, but in being understood. The winter deepened, locking the world in a grip of ice and snow. The child within Seraphina grew stronger, its movements a constant, reassuring presence. Her own strength returned with it, nurtured by purpose and the quiet affection of the family she had inadvertently joined. The children, once wary, now orbited her like small planets. Lyra would bring her wildflowers she'd found sprouting in defiance of the frost. And Finn, though still silent, would take her hand and lead her to the window, pointing out a nesting bird or the shape of a cloud, his eyes a clear, articulate language of their own. One night, the storm that had been threatening for days broke with a terrifying fury. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and a sudden, violent gust ripped a shutter from its hinges. Cold snow blasted into the room. As Kaelin moved to secure the opening, Seraphina felt a sharp, clenching pain in her abdomen, so intense it stole her breath. She cried out, a sound of pure fear. Kaelin was at her side in an instant, his blindness irrelevant in the panicked darkness. He guided her to the bed, his large, warm hand surprisingly gentle as he felt her forehead for fever. "Breathe," he commanded softly. "Breathe with me." The pain subsided, a false alarm, but in those moments of shared terror, something shifted between them. His hands had lingered on her arms, a touch not of ownership but of profound, protective care. The air crackled with an energy that had nothing to do with the storm. It was the silent, terrifying, beautiful spark of new love. Their intimacy grew not in grand declarations, but in the quiet spaces between words. She became his eyes, describing the changing colors of the dawn, the exact shade of blue in Lyra's new ribbon, the expressions on the faces of the merchants they passed in the village. He became her anchor, his steady presence a bulwark against the whispers and stares that still followed her. He taught her the feel of different woods, the heft of his tools, the smell of quenching steel. Their separate worlds began to merge, creating a shared reality built on sensory detail and mutual trust. Finn was the bridge over which their affections traveled most freely. One afternoon, as Serafina was reading a story about a lost fawn, Finn climbed into her lap, a thing he had never done before. He leaned his head against her swollen belly and closed his eyes, listening to the dual rhythm of her heartbeat and her voice. Kaelin, hearing the shift in her breathing, paused his work. He could not see the tableau, but he could feel the rightness of it, a sense of completion that warmed the cold places in his soul. He was falling in love with her, with the strength she veiled in grace, with the kindness she showed his children, with the very sound of her existence. But the world outside their small sanctuary had not forgotten them. As spring approached, the Duke's influence began to poison the air. Rumors, vile and sticky as tar, were spread through the town, that the blind blacksmith was holding the lady against her will, that the child was a demon spawn, that their home was a den of inequity. Kaelin's customers began to dwindle. Contracts were mysteriously cancelled. People who had once greeted him with respect now crossed the street to avoid him. The community that had once been ambivalent now turned hostile, their fear and prejudice stoked by a power they dared not defy. The siege was quiet but relentless, a slow starvation of commerce and companionship. Serafina saw the worry-etched new lines around Kaelin's mouth, heard the strain in his voice as he tried to reassure his children. The shame she thought she had conquered threatened to return, not for herself, but for the hardship she had brought upon this good and honorable man. The pressure culminated in a direct confrontation. One afternoon, her father's steward, a man with a serpent smile and cold, dead eyes, appeared at their door. He did not enter, but stood on the threshold as if the very air inside would contaminate him. He looked from the humble cottage to Serafina's plain homespun dress, his lip curled in a sneer. "The Duke is benevolent," the steward said, his voice dripping with condescension. "He offers you a final chance to escape this squalor. There is a convent, a silent order, that will take you. You will spend your days in prayer and penance, and your bastard will be given to the foundling home." "It is more mercy than you deserve." Before Kaelin could speak, Serafina stepped forward, her posture as straight and proud as any queen's. "Mercy?" she asked, her voice clear and cold as a winter stream. "You speak of mercy, when my father sold me for axe heads. I have found more honor in this blacksmith's home than I ever knew in my father's castle. I am not in squalor. I am home. Now leave this place. You are not welcome here." The steward, stunned by her defiance, could only stammer a threat before turning and retreating, his malicious errand a failure. When he was gone, Serafina turned to Kaelin, her heart pounding. He simply reached out, found her hand, and squeezed it. It was all the confirmation she needed. But their defiance came at a cost. The final contracts dried up. Their stores of food dwindled. The forge grew cold, its heart of fire silenced. One evening, huddled together by a meager fire, the children asleep in the loft, the reality of their situation settled upon them. They were utterly isolated, pushed to the very edge of ruin. The silence in the room was heavy with unspoken fears. It was Kaelin who broke it. "I am sorry, Serafina," he whispered into the gloom. "I brought you from one prison only to lock you in another." She moved closer, taking his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "No," she said, her voice fierce with conviction. "You gave me a home. You gave me back my worth. I have never been more free." She looked at his strong profile, illuminated by the dying embers. "I love you, Kaelin." His sightless eyes seemed to see right into her soul. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her calloused knuckles. "And I love you, Serafina," he confessed, the words a release of a long-held truth. "With you, I am not a blind man in a dark world. You are my light." In that moment of shared despair, their love was not a weakness, but their ultimate weapon. It was the one thing the Duke could not tarnish, could not buy, and could not break. That night, a new fire was lit in Serafina's mind. Love had given her courage, now it would give her a strategy. She could not fight her father with swords or armies, but she could fight him with the tools he had inadvertently given her, her education and her intimate knowledge of his own corruption. For years, she had helped manage the household ledgers, had seen the secret correspondences, had overheard the whispered deals. She knew her father wasn't just cruel, he was a criminal. He had been systematically cheating the crown for years, smuggling untaxed grain across the southern border and using a shell company, managed through the local monastery's accounts, to launder the profits. He believed the abbot to be a pliable, ignorant old man. Serafina knew better. The abbot was a scholar, a man of deep and quiet integrity. Her plan began to form, a delicate and dangerous web of truth. Their first step was to seek an ally. Callan, for all his poverty, had a currency more valuable than gold, a reputation for unimpeachable honesty. Years prior, a great storm had damaged the monastery's bell tower, and Callan had spent a week forging new iron supports, refusing any payment for the sacred work. It was a debt of honor the abbot had never forgotten. The next morning, they went to the monastery. Serafina, her mind a razor-sharp ledger of dates, names, and figures, laid out her father's entire scheme for the abbot. She provided details no outsider could possibly know. The abbot listened, his ancient eyes sharp and discerning. He saw the truth in her words and the quiet dignity of the blind blacksmith who stood by her side. He recognized the duke's avarice for what it was and saw in this unlikely pair a chance to restore justice to the region. He agreed to help. With the church as their shield, they began to gather sworn statements from farmers the duke had cheated and merchants he had strong-armed. The community, seeing the powerful abbot stand with the blacksmith, began to turn. Fear of the duke was replaced by anger at his tyranny. The tide was shifting. The final confrontation took place during the annual Founders' Day festival. The entire town was gathered in the square, the very place where Serafina had been sold. The duke was in attendance, presiding over the ceremonies with his usual pompous authority. At the height of the festivities, the abbot, flanked by a delegation of monks, stepped forward. He did not shout or accuse. In a calm, clear voice, he read from a scroll, detailing the duke's crimes of smuggling, tax evasion, and theft from his own people, providing proof for every charge. He concluded by presenting a letter, authenticated with the royal seal, which had arrived by courier that morning. An investigation had been launched. The duke's properties were seized pending the outcome. The duke's face, a mask of aristocratic pride moments before, crumbled into a canvas of shock and fury. He was surrounded not by enemies with swords, but by the silent, judging eyes of the people he had oppressed. He had been defeated not by force, but by the meticulous memory of a daughter he had discarded and the unimpeachable honor of a man he had deemed worthless. His tyranny was exposed, his power undone by a simple, unshakable truth. In the aftermath, Duke Valerus was stripped of his titles and exiled, a broken man left with nothing but the shame he had so eagerly tried to inflict on his daughter. The world was righted. Serafina and Callan were offered a manor house and a pension from the reclaimed ducal lands, a chance to live as minor gentry. They politely refused. Their kingdom was not one of stone walls and silken banners. It was a kingdom of sturdy walls, the ring of a hammer on steel, and the warmth of a family forged in adversity. The town, now free from the duke's shadow, embraced them. Callan's forge roared back to life, busier than ever, his work sought after for its skill and its inherent honesty. Their home was no longer a place of hiding, but a beacon of resilience. A few weeks later, as the last rays of a summer sunset streamed through the window of their small bedroom, Serafina gave birth to a beautiful, healthy daughter with a tuft of dark hair and her mother's determined eyes. Lyra and Finn crowded around, their faces filled with awe. As Serafina held the newborn, Finn, the boy who had been lost in silence for years, reached out a small hand and gently touched the baby's cheek. He then looked up at Serafina, his eyes shining with a new light. He opened his mouth, and a single, perfect word emerged, a sound of pure love and belonging. Mama, it was more than a word, it was a benediction. It was the final, triumphant note in their symphony of healing. Callan knelt by the bed, reaching out to encompass his entire family in his arms, the woman who was his light, the daughter who was his voice, the son who had found his way back from silence, and the new baby who was their shared future. True nobility, Serafina now knew, was not a name you were given, but a life you built. It wasn't found in castles or bloodlines, but in the strength to shield another from the storm. True worth was not measured in gold or land, but in the courage to love in the face of despair and to find purpose in the pieces of a broken life. Their home, once a refuge from the world, had become its own world, a small but unshakable kingdom founded not on power or privilege, but on the enduring, unyielding truth of a love that had been forged in the darkest of fires.